Economics Beyond Money. How Things We Did Became Things We Buy. In his book Growing Up, Russell Baker, the New York Times columnist, described the kitchen table of his childhood. It was Belleville, New Jersey, in the depths of the Depression. Baker was living with his mother and sister and an extended family of aunts and uncles. There was no television, no money for going out, few places to go anyway. Yet Baker remembers those evenings with affection and warmth. Often, waking deep in the night, I heard them down in the kitchen talking, Baker wrote years later. Sitting around the table under the unshaded light bulb, they talked the nights away, reheating the coffee, then making fresh coffee, then reheating the pot again, and talking. The family talked about Father Coughlin, Mussolini, the New Deal WPA, which stood for We Poke Along, according to Baker's Uncle Alan. They discussed ways to outwin the electric company, debated the merits of crooners being Crosby versus Rooney Valley. They told and retold the old family stories, for example, the time two carpenters mistook ancient Aunt Henrietta for a ghost and jumped out a second-story window. I would lie on my daybed half awake listening to the murmur of voices, the clatter of cups, the splash of water in the sink, the occasional burst of laughter, Baker called. If my homework was done, I could sit with them and listen until 10 o'clock struck. I loved the sense of family warmth that radiated through those long kitchen nights of talk. A great deal was happening at that kitchen table, though few would have thought about it at the time. For young Baker, the talk was a school, a window on the adult world that kids today get mainly through the manipulated lens of television. For adults, the kitchen table was a crossroads of generations, a place where everybody belonged, and a refuge from the discouragement of those hard years. Today it would be called therapy or group support. The kitchen table was also what economists might call an information system, where needs and resources were matched. Fred, can you take Aunt Mary to the store this afternoon? To this day, the kitchen table survives as a symbol of social cohesion. Retired people who work in time-dollar programs remember it as a reference point for family and community. The neighborhood was an extension of that table. Betty Little, a worker in the Washington, D.C. time-dollar program, recalls the lady in her Buffalo, New York, neighborhood whom everyone called Aunt Lizzie. She wasn't really an aunt, just someone who would stop by to make sure the family had something hot to eat. Then, too, there was Mrs. Jones up the street. Her husband hunted, and she had no children, so she made big pots of rabbit stew for the neighbors. We were family with most of the kids on the street, Little recalls. That closely woven world has unraveled for most Americans today. Aunts and uncles and grandparents and even parents live far apart. Parents often are reduced to the role of purchasing agents, procuring the daycare, schooling, entertainment that define their children's lives. In architecture, we're seeing demands for media rooms, a New York City architect told Newsweek magazine not long ago. Whatever happened to the kitchen table as a gathering place? The sources of these changes looked like 50 different things, the litany of forces that swept through the American household after World War II. Cars. Divorce. TV. The entry of women into the workforce. But underneath the blur was one big thing. The things the kitchen table represented: companionship, entertainment, security, intimacy, even gossip, turned into things people buy for money. Families and neighborhoods were taken apart function by function and sold back to people who missed the things these once provided. Massive social problems ensued: as the glue that held people together no longer seemed to be there. Then government was forced to try to patch up the damage with programs and services bought for money. It happened in two main stages. First, enterprise became disengaged from the core of community life. Production moved out of the home and small workshop and into the large factory, owned by a corporate entity with no local roots. This disrupted the world in which commercial dealings were entwined in a web of larger community concerns. And then, the economy redefined people as consumers, so that things bought seemed more desirable and modern than the things to be had for free. The common denominator is that people came to relate increasingly through the medium of money. Community custom yields to corporate need. This process was especially marked in the United States, a new society established during the transition to a monetary age, commemorated in the Latin inscription on the dollar bill, Novus Ordo Seclorum, a new order in the world. In the early colonies, money was a hodgepodge of currencies, banknotes, and the like. Most transactions were in barter or change work, which is an exchange of labor between, say, two farmers. Money might be thrown in for good measure, because people needed a certain amount of it to pay taxes and deal with the world outside the community. Such transactions tended to reinforce local ties. People saw commerce as a form of social connection as well as an avenue of gain. Prices, for example, were set by local custom, rather than by the market. As late as 1838, a farmer complained to the Albany Cultivator, a farm newspaper, that the local miller was charging 20% rather than the customary 10%. Wasn't there a law? There wasn't, as far as the editor knew. But he thought there should be. Custom, which in the absence of law has the binding force of law, seems to have settled the toll at 10%, this editor replied. If the miller can with impunity take 20, he may by the same rule take 50%. It takes a long stretch of the mind to envision a day, in America, when people considered community norms a legitimate check on the profit-making urge. Yet that was the world that greeted the industrial age and its chief engine of change, the corporation. Soon, these corporations were ripping commerce from its local base and redefining America as a mass market. Dealings based on locality and trust gave way to dealings governed solely by the market and through the vehicle of money. John O'Hara captured the essence of the change in a short story called The Hardware Man, about two merchants in a Pennsylvania town. One, Tom Easterly, was a man of the old order, whose business dealings were of a piece with his community concerns. The other, Lou Mouser, was a shrewd and driven man, not dishonest but focused exclusively on making money. Instinctively, this was the 1920s, he seized upon aggressive tactics that drove Easterly out of business. He ran big ads, opened branch stores, sold at cost during promotional sales. He even hired away Easterly's help. In the closing scene, Mouser is offering to buy out Easterly's stock for 20 cents of the dollar, fixtures and goodwill included. Easterly demurs. The fixtures he can have, but the goodwill is separate. It isn't for sale to you, he says. A week from Saturday night at 9 o'clock, this store goes out of business forever. But no part of it belongs to you. When goodwill meant something to everyone. Once the word goodwill had a very specific meaning, namely, the value of the good name that a business built up in a community. It had to do with honesty and fairness and kindred qualities. Today it is a shell, a neutered accounting catch-all for the difference between what somebody pays for a company and the physical value of the assets. The degeneration of the word typified the passage from a kitchen table world of relationships and trust to a world held together, or pulled apart, by money. Thomas Sterleys were common in 19th-century commerce. Even large manufacturers, when they were individuals rather than large corporations, felt a commitment to the communities of which they were part. Andrew Carnegie left a large legacy to the city of Pittsburgh. Factory towns all over the United States boast similar bequests in the form of schools, museums, parks, and the like. In the old mill town of Winsett, Connecticut, Ralph Nader's hometown, the local library and high school were gifts of a manufacturer who owned the Gilbert Clock Company there. Today, by contrast, relations between corporations and localities consist largely of corporate demands for tax breaks, highway access, sewer hookups and other subsidies, with new plants going to the highest bidder. While community ties were turning into monetary transactions, the work of caring for others was doing so as well. The factory took work out of the home and community, swept it into the vortex of the national and international marketplace. Soon, traditional functions of care were drifting out of the domestic sphere and into institutions supported by taxes. In the colonies, care for the poor was typically based in the home. Whenever possible, a community supported members in their own families, writes David Rothman of Columbia University in his award-winning book The Discovery of the Asylum. In extenuating circumstances of old age, widowhood, or debility, it boarded them in a neighboring household. That changed when mobility and large-scale industry forced people to resort to institutional forms of care. We don't provide care, we buy it. The rise of industry was not the only thing, of course, that hastened the separation of community and care. Affluence further disposed the nation to want to buy care rather than provide it. Robert and Helen Lynn noted this in their classic study of Middletown back in the 1920s. Neighborhood and face-to-face charity loomed large among those who were less well off, they wrote. By contrast, the more impersonal group methods of giving are, on the contrary, diffusing more rapidly among the business class. These business leaders in Middletown took the lead in starting a community chest, which further converted the practice of charity into the contribution of money, useful as that may be. The Lynns compared this effort to a high-pressure sales campaign, adding, there was a minimum of Christian caritas about it. Put another way, people were becoming purchasers of community and care rather than participants in it. Labor was dividing to the point that these functions were being contracted out to professional charities. Traditional community bonds had increasingly little function. This trend continued as Americans left the farm and swarmed into cities along with immigrants, and the New Deal put the federal government into the business of social welfare. What the corporation did to the small town, bureaucratized social service did somewhat to the old urban neighborhood, displacing the local ward healer and other forms of one-to-one service. These local systems were far from perfect, especially for those who didn't vote the right way. But with the rise of bureaucratized social service, nothing was done to replace the cohesion these old networks provided. The Mario brothers replaced the family. After World War II, this process of turning bonds of locality and trust into monetary exchanges took a new and especially destructive turn. In the 19th century, people were wrenched out of traditional social roles to become employees in mass production. After World War II, their role was increasingly to consume the things produced, and consumption became a substitute for the many social ties that remained. In the 1950s, Ronald Reagan, corporate spokesman for General Electric, declaimed on the GE Theater every week that progress is our most important product. He was talking about the very devices, televisions, dishwashers, and the rest, that undermined the center of his Norman Rockwell world. Put another way, families turned over the functions of the kitchen table to corporations. Labor divided to the point that people at the table had little reason to be there. This is one change that retirees who work in time-dollar programs feel personally. Esterline Colebrook, who works in the Miami program, was asked to speak to a high school class on what it feels like to be growing old. Colebrook is a grandmother whose father lived to be 120 and whose grandfather was a slave. There was lots of storytelling in her household, and one thing she conveyed to the high school class was the isolation she feels because television has displaced this bond. "Before, we didn't have the radio and TV," she said. "So you would always love to sit next to your grandmother so she could tell you the old stories. Or read you a story. It was like story time. Because you didn't have those other things. When you came in at night to go to bed, you would always cling to grandmother, because that was the best entertainment. But now it's the TV and the kids don't have time. They don't even see you. And then we feel real lonely. It's the gap between us now." Ray Hughes, a retired merchant seaman who works in the Elder Plan program in Brooklyn, put it simply. "My grandchildren would rather play Nintendo than come and visit me," he said. I So off to work I go. Americans like to point the finger at government. But what we see is what we are, and there is a troubling similarity between the fiscal travails on Capitol Hill and the finances of businesses and families throughout the land. The federal deficit has mirrored, for example, the growing mountains of private debt. From 1980 to 1987, while the federal deficit was reaching record levels, consumer debt doubled from $300 billion to $600 billion. Not coincidentally, the number of Americans going bankrupt more than doubled over roughly the same period. The Reagan years brought a phenomenon unseen in America before. Not only were personal bankruptcies increasing, they were increasing in good times rather than bad. Often, the victims weren't people with too little money, rather people who were too inclined to spend. One study of personal bankruptcies in the 1980s found that a third of the families owed 3 months' income on their credit cards alone. That grim prospect helps explain the bumper sticker that became popular toward the end of the decade, "I owe. So off to work I go." A rising need to buy help. This spending was not just the result of yuppie self-indulgence, however. Americans found themselves in the distressing circumstance of running harder and harder just to stay even. Ease, security, the good life, the promise of American marketing somehow had become a frenzied pursuit. Rising home prices and other kinds of inflation were certainly part of it, the media reported on these in great detail. But the other, and perhaps greater, part was something beyond the ken of most economists and reporters. The problem was need inflation as opposed to price inflation. Not only were there so many more things that Americans felt they had to buy, Americans also needed to buy what the family used to provide for free. As social bonds turned into commodities, families and communities began contracting out their functions to the market economy. Let kindergarten watch the toddlers. Let preschool open their eyes to life. Hire counselors for neglected, latchkey kids. Buy entertainment from Nintendo and the video store. For adults, turn time away from work into a leisure industry, which sells camcorders and motorized treadmills in place of visits on the side porch and walks through the neighborhood. In virtually every corner of family and community life, the things people used to do have turned into things they have to buy. Partly this was the effect of broken families and moving about and affluence itself. Visitors from other countries remark on how separate Americans are, shutting themselves into their living rooms with their private entertainment equipment. But effect turns into cause, as families and communities without functions have less centripetal activity to hold them together. Put another way, the cash marketplace has been cannibalizing the old informal ways of doing, leaving families and communities helpless in the face of new problems coming to their doors. Neighborhoods in which people barely know one another don't have much connective tissue with which to resist drugs or crime. Security from crime no longer means the watchfulness of neighbors. Rather it means insurance policies, burglar alarms, and other devices, largely to protect the VCR and other expensive equipment, as well as greater demands for police. These changes are so entwined in our lives today, that we hardly notice. In the public discourse, they are called progress and growth, leaving people in the strange situation of feeling more harried and pressed even as things supposedly are getting better. But if the process is rarely noted for what it is, the impact is all too apparent as an insatiable need for cash. The effort to get the cash, through to worker families, for example, means yet more need for things like daycare and extra cars that require yet more money to purchase. One congressional study found that the average two-parent family was little better off in 1988 than it was 10 years before. More mothers were working, and working more hours, but the costs of child care, transportation, and taxes were eating up much of the gain. The impact is also apparent in a greater need for government. Economists use the term externality to describe the process by which a cost of business gets shifted onto someone else. Industry has externalized the cost of pollution, for example, by dumping wastes into the air and water for government to cope with, instead of preventing the effluents or disposing of them safely. Something very similar happened as what economists call the division of labor invaded the household economy of family and community. The costs to government have been large, in the form of new needs for social services, education, police, and the like. Private gain, social disaster. It is not surprising that industry got on this bandwagon. After all, it is their wagon, and they were shifting the costs to government. But economists are another matter. The word economics derives from a Greek word meaning the proper stewardship of the household. When the household falls apart, presumably it would concern a profession bearing that name. Yet this very profession was leading the parade. By a strange twist of history and logic, the breakdown of family and community became something to cheer about. The more the kids were schlepped off to daycare, the more they played Nintendo instead of talking to their parents, the more seniors needed professional home care instead of soup from Aunt Lizzie, the more money was changing hands and, therefore, the more economists beamed. To understand why, we need to go back to Adam Smith. Before Smith's time, there wasn't a subject called economics as that term is used today. Commercial dealings were considered mainly in light of ethics and religion. There was much debate over the concept of a just price, for example. The underlying assumption was that prices should be governed by a sense of justice rather than, as economists today believe, whatever the market will bear. That's where Smith, the father of free market economics, came in. He posed a direct challenge to the medieval worldview and the bonds of affinity that held it together. According to The Wealth of Nations, human well-being, the original meaning of the word wealth, would arise if all sought to increase their personal, private gain. This pursuit became a virtue. Economics was yanked out of the context of social and moral teachings and set free in a universe of its own, governed by separate laws. Today, Smith's theories are favored on the political right, which claims also the mantle of traditional family and community values. Yet these values are precisely what Smith's economics tend to displace. The kitchen table is not a place where people maximize their profits. The profit maximizers invade the table with new things to sell. This myopia is built into the lens through which economists see the world. The prime index of the national well-being is the gross national product, GNP, and the GNP measures nothing but transactions for money. The kitchen table economy, the whole realm of informal helping and caring, barely exists where the GNP is concerned. So when their functions are contracted out to corporations or to government, they enter reality as economists define it. Few economists bother to ask whether this growth they hail is actually little more than this cannibalizing process, the economy growing by eating the flesh and sinews that hold society together. Nor do economists ask whether economic slowdowns are times when, in part at least, the destructive process has somewhat abated. In sum, economics today isn't concerned with social health, except incidentally. Its sole focus is exchanges involving money. To raise questions about money, therefore, is to question some of the notions that economists most cherish. The things money can't measure. Economists protest that money is just a measuring rod, as neutral as a ruler. It's not fair to blame the ruler for what it measures, they say. If Kindercare or Meals on Wheels displaces Aunt Lizzie, then Lizzie must be inferior, so good riddance. The market decides, not us. But then, who was left to look after the sick people on the block or to make sure the elderly actually ate the meals the programs dropped off? For a while, it seemed possible to simply tax the market economy further, or to stimulate it with tax breaks, to generate revenue for new programs. But then competition became global, limiting the amount that could be wrung out of the market economy in any one country, to help correct the damage it was abetting. And the programs weren't working that well anyway. The nature of money was implicated in this fiscal gridlock. Money is not just a measuring rod. It is also the thing measured, that which defines the world that economists choose to see. A person who measures only by feet and inches misses entire dimensions of reality, such as time. Similarly, economists who measure only by money miss those dimensions of life that money does not and cannot measure. They don't understand the kitchen table world, and so are oblivious to how the erosion of that world contributes to the social problems that we face. Until now, this closed system has precluded insight or debate. One cannot think one's way out from a closed system to something bigger. One needs a viewpoint outside the system to see where it has failed. Time Dollars provides that vantage point.